Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to start on this crosshead here, and this piece rides back and forth in here, and it translates the motion from the connecting rod to the piston. So the connecting rod will actually move in an arc as this moves around, but then the piston only goes back and forth. So this connects the two of them, and I'm going to make this out of cast iron. So I've got this random chunk of cast iron here, and if you watched my video making the Webster engine, I took a dumbbell and cut that down to make the flywheel. So I had some remnants left off of it that I had cut off with the bandsaw. So I've got this marked out here, wider than it needs to be, but we'll get this in the bandsaw and cut us out a section here to start with. Then we'll go over to the lathe and start machining it to size, and then we'll get these grooves, and it gets a groove through it here. Then it gets a shoulder machined on it on the side. The shoulder will ride in these on these crosshead guides here, and then it gets drilled and tapped in the front. We'll first start with the bandsaw and get us a section sawed out to start working with. Okay, so we got that piece done. It's a little bit of a tricky piece to make. So we squared it up here to 5/8 by 7/16. Then set it up in the mill, or the lathe in this case, doing the mill. Then picked up this edge here and was able to mill these slots here on the side. Then I went ahead and drilled this hole here. It's a 1/16 for a 1/16 pin, which I've cut a piece of drill rod here that we'll use for that. We'll put that in after we get the connecting rod made. So that goes into there and holds the connecting rod. So I went ahead and drilled this, and then drilled this and tapped this for the 348. Then we set it back up in the lathe and then milled this 3/16 slot out here in the middle. So let's see how it works. So it's going to go in the crosshead here, and then this will run back and forth between here. So we'll put the top on here for the other side. Get the nuts on there. Then we'll snug this up a little bit. You may have to do some filing or adjusting a little bit on this depending on where you ended up at on the width and the height of these spacers. There's a lot of stuff that's got to line up here. So there we go. It's got a good, nice fit. And then this hole should line up with our cylinder. Looks like it's going to line up pretty good. So that completes our crosshead guide here. The next thing I'm going to work on is the connecting rod, so we can go ahead and connect the crankshaft to this piece. So when we turn this will go back and forth. So it's a piece of 3/16 wide by, it'll end up 5/16 rounded on the edge here. On the ends it's rounded and it's got just a little bit of a taper to it here in the middle. So I'm going to make this out of aluminum, and I've got just a scrap piece here. So it's already the correct 3/16 wide, and it's a little bit too tall, and then it's rough cut here. So what I'm going to try to do is set this up and turn it between centers. So I've marked the center for the width here, and then close to the center on the width in the long direction here. Made a punch mark. So we're going to set this up and drill this out for the dead center, and then we're going to set this up and drive it with a dog to turn this between centers. And then we'll go ahead and get this turned down to this 5/16 on this end, and then gets turned down to a 1/4 inch on this end, and then we'll relieve it here in the middle. And then we'll probably set up the compound and cut this. It's just a slight taper. It's 1/8 inch on one end and then 3/32 on the other end over about a 2 inch distance here. So it's got just a slight taper to it. So we'll get this set up in the lathe and start getting it turned down. Okay, so this is what we ended up with after turning that down. So we're flat on the sides, 3/16 wide, and then we're 5/16 here. but before I continue turning this down, it gets turned down to a 1/4 inch on the small end, and then there's a taper, gets turned down in the middle. I'm gonna mark the center of this, and then I'm gonna drill the holes for the big end and the small end before we turn this down, because once we turn this down, it's gonna be hard to mark a center line. So we know what this distance here is, the 5/16. So I've set my height gauge to, I got it on a 1-inch block here, and I've set my height gauge to 1 inch and then half of 5/16. So we'll scribe us a line here. So now we've got a line in the center. Then I'm gonna just measure it. This piece is still long. We left it long so that we could get rid of these ends here where we was turning it. So I'm gonna measure it and then mark the center, and then come from the center to mark each line, and we'll make some punch marks and go ahead and get those drilled and reamed. Then we'll set this back up in the lathe between centers, and then we'll turn down the small end and then turn down the taper section in the middle. I got the connecting rod finished up. Got it installed on there. So it was a tricky little piece to make. So once I drilled the holes in the big end and the small end, then we set it back up between centers on the lathe. And then I turned this small end down here to 1/4 of an inch. And I plunged in here where my lines was to work out this center section. And then that is, it's 1/8 of an inch on this end. So I worked this section out here with some right hand and left hand tools. And then it's got a little bit of a taper to it. It's supposed to be smaller, 3/32 up here on this end, but that's such a small taper, and this part was getting pretty fragile since it's aluminum. So I did the taper with just a file and some sandpaper. So it's hard to see, but it's a little bit smaller up on this end than it is on this end. Then I took and cut a chamfer here on this edge and on this edge on the inside there. And then to round the ends off, I used my belt sander corner rounding fixture. If you've not seen that in the playlist for tools, there's a couple of episodes that goes over the construction of that. And it worked great to round those over, so you can see how the crosshead moves back and forth. Everything's moving freely. So that's going to finish up the connecting rod. Good fit here on the crank pin. So the next thing we're going to do is make the rod that is for the piston. So there's a rod that will come, screws into the end of this crosshead, and then has the piston on the end of it. So I've got just a random rod here to start with. It's a little bit long. We'll have to turn it down some. It gets threaded 3/48. So that will go in the end here. You can see it's way too long. So we'll get this turned down to dimension and get that threaded. And then I'm going to make the piston. So in the notes here, it says that the guy made his piston out of Teflon. So I'm going to try, I have some 1/2 inch dowel in here. This is just a hard black plastic. And once we get the rod made, then we will work on the piston. It gets a couple of, it's a 1/4 inch wide here, and then gets a couple of oil grooves. And then here's the piston rod that we're going to make out of this piece here. So right now it's just a little bit too big. It's a little bit over 1/2 inch, just a little bit tight in the cylinder. So we'll just take a little bit of light sandpaper and polish that down to where it's a nice, good, tight fit in the cylinder. So that it gets a couple of little tiny 10 thousandths wide by 5 thousandths deep oil grooves. So we'll probably have to grind up a tool, just a real tiny tool, to cut these little oil grooves here. And then we counterbore it, the diameter of this rod, and then drill and tap it for 3/48. So we're going to try that. I'm not completely crazy about locating that piston on threads. Threads are, sometimes they're not exactly concentric. It can move it a little bit off side to side. I would prefer to have a nice tight fit on the rod and then have it stick through and maybe put a nut on the end of it. But we'll try it this way. I think it'll work, and if it doesn't work, we can try something different. So we'll get this rod set up and get it cut down and threaded, and then get this plastic dowel in here set up and get us a piston made. And then this is not in the plans, but I made up a few oil cups that I'm going to put here. I'm going to put an oil cup on each one of these crosshead guides, and then I'm going to put a small oil cup in each of these bearings. I'll show you what the oil cup's going to look like. It is teeny tiny. So this is a 256 thread here on the end, and then it's got a 40 thousandths hole through it, and then it's got an 1/8 inch hole there for the reservoir. So these are extremely small. And easy to lose. So I made up 4 of those, and then once I have this torn back apart and I have this crankshaft out, we'll drill and tap this here, and for an oil cup here on each of the main bearings, and then we'll drill these crosshead guides here and tap that, and then there will be an oil cup on each of these. So it'll be fine without it. You could put some oil in here, but that'll just help get oil directly into the crankshaft and on this crosshead here. So we'll get this rod set up and start machining on it. Okay, I got the piston rod finished up and the piston, and I made a nut. I didn't have any 348 nuts, so I made that nut and then made the piston, put the oil grooves in there, and then I went ahead and drilled and tapped for the oil cups here in the main bearings and in the crosshead, so you can see how everything's going to work now. And you definitely don't want any bonding in anything. If anything's bonding, now's a good time to address that. You just want it to rotate free. And then we'll check our cylinder here. And it lines up good with the piston. So the height's good on everything. And then the piston has got a good seal on the cylinder. It'll actually hold a vacuum if I put the cylinder in there and then pull it out. So I think that's going to work good. So that's going to do it for this episode. Come back next time. We're going to actually get started on the cylinder here. We've got the hole in the middle, but we'll go ahead and start doing the rest of the features. There's a lot of machining that goes on here. We have to leave a lot of this on the side, turn these ends down, round, do all the porting, drill all that, and then eventually tap and drill the holes to get it mounted down. So come back next time and we'll get started on that. Thanks for watching.